How's everybody doing? We feeling good? All right, excellent. Welcome back from lunch. For the next 20 so minutes, we are going to talk about habit-forming technology, because if there's one thing that we know about the technologies that we use, is that they can profoundly change our day-to-day behaviors, right? We heard from expert after expert today about how profoundly these technologies can change our day-to-day lives. And so what I've done over the past several years is to look for patterns, to figure out what's common about these technologies that can so profoundly change our day-to-day habits. And I'm talking about the usual suspects, right? I'm talking about Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and Pinterest, these companies that somehow come out of nowhere and in 5 to 10 years are something that hundreds of millions, if not billions of people are using every single day. Why? What are the common elements behind these products? And what's the deeper psychology about how these products hook us? I've compiled what I've learned over the past 2.5 years inside this book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And before I kick off, I want to just say a short apology that normally when I teach this material, I teach it at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford and at the Design School at Stanford. It's usually a 3-week course. I'm condensing it down to about 20 minutes. So it's going to be very fast, but there's a lot more in the book to check out. So what I found repeated time and time again in these products was that they leveraged the power of habits. If you think about habits, habits are very simply defined as these behaviors done with little or no conscious thought. It's about 50% of what you do day in and day out is done with little or no conscious thought, whether you like it or not. And I believe that we are on the precipice of an age where we can use habits for good, and I'm not alone. There's an explosion of companies today that are using the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives, and that's what I want to help you do today. So this pattern that I saw repeated time and time again inside these habit-forming products, I call the hook. And the hook, very simply, is an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And what we find is by taking users through this 4-step process in series, these hooks create users' preferences, they change user tastes, and they create our day-to-day habits. So let me take you very, very quickly through a 30,000-foot overview of this hook model, this pattern we see repeated time and time again. It starts off with a trigger, through the action, to the reward, and then finally the investment. Let's talk about the trigger phase of the hook model. Now, triggers come in 2 types, 2 flavors, if you will. We have our external triggers, and we have our internal triggers. Now, external triggers, you'll be very familiar with. External triggers are things in our outside environment that cue our next action, but the information for what to do next is inside the trigger itself. So a call to action like click here or play now or buy this, these are all calls to action that tell us what to do next. In the real world, it might be a cop telling you which way to turn in traffic or a friend telling you about this great new app you should try out. All examples of external triggers. You know all about external triggers. But what you may not consider when you design your experience are the internal triggers. These internal triggers, just as predictably cue our action, but the information for what to do next is informed through an association in the user's mind. So what we do in response to being in a certain place, around certain people, when we partake in certain routines or certain situations, and most frequently when we experience certain emotions, dictates our next behavior. Not just any emotion, though. I'm speaking of more particularly negative emotions. So what we do when we're feeling lonesome or indecisive or bored or lost or fearful, what we do when we experience these states dictates the products we turn to, the solutions we look for to get out of these states. Some of the research that shows us that this is the case comes from a study that showed that people suffering from clinical depression check email more. Now let's think about this for a minute. Why would people with clinical depression check email more? I gave this workshop at a company recently, and somebody stood up in the back of the room and said, it's because email makes us depressed. Well, that wasn't exactly what this study concluded. What this study found was that people suffering from clinical depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the general population. And what were they doing to boost their mood, to take themselves out of this negative valence state? They were turning to their technologies. They were using technologies more frequently than the general population. And let's think about this in our own lives. What technology do we use when we're feeling lonely? Shout it out. What do we use? Facebook, of course, right? And what technology do we use when we're feeling unsure about pretty much anything? Before we scan our brains, we Google it, of course. And what about when we're feeling bored? Between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you have that big project you don't feel like finishing, what do? We click onto YouTube, we check Pinterest, we check stock prices and sports scores and news updates. All these solutions for this painful internal trigger of boredom. We do not like that feeling, and we seek to get out of that state. So what does this mean for us as product designers? Maybe some of you learned something about yourself and what triggers your own behavior, but how do we make this practical when it comes to building products that help people improve their lives? Well, it comes down to fundamentally understanding what your user's internal trigger is. It's very hard to scratch someone's itch, to connect a solution to their problem without properly identifying this internal trigger. It's absolutely critical for these repeat habitual behaviors, understanding your user's internal trigger. So that's a very, very high overview of the trigger phase. There's a lot more to discuss there, but let me take you into the action phase of the hook. The action phase is the actual behavior itself that's repeated through these hooks processes, and it's defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward. Let me show you some examples of how simple I mean by simple. Something as simple as a scroll on Pinterest, or searching on Google, or something as easy and effortless as pushing play on YouTube. The simplest action in anticipation of reward. And of course, there's a model, there's a formula to predict these singular actions. We heard the creator of this formula right on this very stage, the Fogg behavior model, which says B equals MAT. Every human behavior is a function of motivation, ability, and a trigger. I'm not going to go into too much depth here because BJ did it himself, and I'm kind of a disciple of his line of thinking. But just a quick overview. Edward D.C., the father of self-determination theory, defines motivation as the energy for action, how much we want to do something. And Fogg gives us these 6 levers that we find again and again in every piece of ad copy, every commercial you've ever seen, all uses these 6 basic human motivators. That we seek pleasure and avoid pain. We seek hope and avoid fear. We seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. Now, the next factor is, of course, ability. And here again, Fogg gives us these 6 factors, these 6 things that make something easier to do. Because, of course, the easier something is to do, the more likely we are to do it. So if something takes less time, costs less money, requires less physical effort, takes fewer brain cycles. Of course, this is a very big one when it comes to the technologies we build, because the easier something is to understand, the more likely it is for that behavior to occur. Social deviance, that we do things that other people like us are doing. And then finally, and I think most importantly, non-routine. Because it turns out that habits have a repeater effect. The more we do something, the easier it becomes, and therefore the more likely we are to do it in the future. What do we call that? It's called practice. The more we do it, the easier it becomes, the more likely we are to do it in the future. So habits have this very important repeater effect. The next phase of the hook model is the reward phase. After the user has been triggered, either internally or externally, they take this simple action in anticipation of reward. Now it's time for the reward itself. And when we talk about rewards, we have to start deep in the brain. In the area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, right here between your temples, was first studied by 2 Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner. And Olds and Milner determined that something very peculiar happened when they inserted electrodes inside the brains of lab animals and allowed them to self-stimulate. So they had these little rats. They put an electrode inside this part of the brain. They let them press on a little lever. And what they found is that the rats wanted nothing else. All they wanted to do was to continue to press this button. And in fact, in human experiments where they did the very same thing, they observed the same behavior. People would incessantly click on these buttons to continue to stimulate this part of the brain. They would forgo food, water, sex, everything else. They had to have the machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop stimulating this very special part of the brain. It turns out we don't need electrodes to stimulate the nucleus accumbens. Other things also activate this part of the brain. Luxury goods, sex, certain chemicals, junk food, and of course, right there in the center, our technologies, all activate this very same part of the brain. Now, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community at the time believed that what they had discovered was the brain's pleasure center, right? Why else would lab animals and people incessantly stimulate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. What we now know about how the brain works is that what Olds and Milner had discovered was not necessarily the pleasure center, but they had figured out what activates the stress of desire. The stress of desire. Because it turns out that this area of the brain, which you see here, becomes active when we anticipate a reward, when we anticipate the thing that we think is going to make us feel good. But when we actually get it, when we actually receive the thing that's supposed to make us feel good, that part of the brain becomes less active. So this part of the brain is really all about the itch. It's that itch we seek to scratch, that desire, that craving, that lusting to do a particular behavior turns out to be the role of this very special part of the brain. And it also turns out that there is a way to supercharge that stress of desire. Anybody want to know how? Anybody curious? Exactly. The unknown is fascinating. So when I asked you a question and I took that long pause and I asked you for a response, I did something a little bit different, right? I changed my cadence. I took that pause. And some of you perked up. What's he going to do next? And it turns out that this element of variability, this bit of mystery, is endemic to all sorts of experiences that capture our attention, that hold our focus, and by the way, it's highly habit-forming. And of course, the research that shows us this is the case comes out of the classic work of B.F. Skinner. Many of you might remember him from your Psych 101 class, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner took these pigeons, put them in a small cage. He gave them a little lever, and at first, whenever they would press on the lever, they would receive a reward, right? A little food pellet. So basically, the pigeons would eat whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something a little different. He introduced a bit of variability. So sometimes the pigeons would click the lever, but nothing would come out. The next time the pigeon would click the lever, they would receive a reward. And adding that bit of variability, an intermittent reward, increased the rate of response. The number of times the pigeons clicked the lever was observed to occur more frequently. Because what we now know is that variability spikes activity in this part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. And what we find time and time again in all sorts of habit-forming experiences are one or more of these variable reward types, what I call rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. And you'll see these in all sorts of habit-forming and even addictive products. So for example, the search for social rewards, what I call rewards of the tribe, these are all about things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and come from other people. The search for empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good, partnerships, cooperation, competition, all examples of variable rewards of the tribe. Online, there's probably no better example, of course, than social media, where when Mark Zuckerberg got married, 1.3 million people liked it. Think about all the variability that's involved with a site like Facebook. When you open up that news feed, you're not quite sure what you're going to find. What did people post? What pictures might you see? How many people liked it? Who commented? What did they say? A whole lot of variability associated with what you might find every time you engage with a product like Facebook. And of course, there are many other examples. Next comes rewards of the hunt. This stems from our primal search for resources like food, shelter, other resources. And of course, in modern society, we buy these things with money. So when many people think of variable rewards, they think about slot machines, they think about gambling, where the variable reward is, of course, the currency, the money itself that comes out of these machines. But what you may not consider is that you see the same exact mechanics when it comes to information rewards, another example of a reward of the hunt. So when you're on Twitter, for example, or any other product that has this feed mechanic, you take a look, right? That's not interesting, but that's interesting. And to get more, what do? Just scroll, right? So this becomes very similar to this. Both variable rewards of the hunt. Searching and never done searching. Finally, there's this search for self-achievement, what I call rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about these material or resource rewards. These are things that feel good in and of themselves, so-called intrinsic motivators. The search for mastery, consistency, competency, control are all examples of these rewards of the self. So, of course, it's appropriate that we talk about games. Getting to the next level, the next achievement, the next accomplishment is very much about these rewards of the self. Even if no one else is playing, these things are intrinsically fun and rewarding. Now, even if you say to yourself, you know what, I'm not much of a gamer, I don't really understand all that, I bet you play this game every day. Checking those unread messages, seeing that jewel icon on an app, and you just gotta press it. Clearing those to-do lists that keep coming, those to-do items that keep coming into you, those are all examples of variable rewards of the self. The whole point of the variable rewards phase is to scratch the user's itch, to give them what they came for, and yet leave them wanting more. Where I see sometimes gamification efforts go awry is when they forget this fundamental principle that the variable reward has to match the internal trigger. There has to be a match there. So if the itch is boredom, you damn well better entertain through the variable reward. If the internal trigger is seeking connection and loneliness, well, you better connect people to other people. So just plopping on gamification mechanics without considering, are you actually I really messed that one up. Are you actually scratching the user's itch? Wow. Are you actually scratching the user's itch? Is doomed to failure. We have to figure out that match between the user's itch and the reward. Finally, the last phase of the hook model is the investment phase. The investment phase is the part of the hook that I see most often neglected, where I think there's the most opportunity to improve the typical habit-forming experience. Because the investment phase is a bit of work that the user does for a future benefit. It's not about immediate gratification. It's about some kind of future reward, some future benefit. And investments, the fundamental purpose of these investments is to increase the next pass through the hook in two ways. Number one, investments load the next trigger. Investments load the next trigger. So for example, when I use an app like WhatsApp, by the way, if you need an example of the power of habits, I'll give you 19 billion reasons why habits are so powerful. This is an app that is used by 74% of the people who have downloaded it every single day. So this is a great example of an investment. When I send someone a message on WhatsApp, there's no immediate gratification, right? I don't get any points or badges. I'm not entered into any kind of leaderboard. But what I am doing, I'm investing in this platform, and I'm more likely to use it again because I'm likely to get one of these. This external trigger telling me that someone has replied, bringing me back into the hook the next time. The second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by storing value. You know, one of the reasons I love working in technology products is because unlike physical things, these chairs, your laptops, your cell phones, all of these things lose value with time, right? They depreciate with usage. However, habit-forming products have this very peculiar trait that they should appreciate with value. They should get better the more we use them. So for example, the more content I put into iTunes, the better it becomes as my one and only music library. The more data I put into a product like Mint or Pinterest, the better the product becomes for me. It's tailored to my needs. I can do more and more with the product, the more data, the more stored value I put into it. Followers, the more followers I have on a product like Twitter, the more valuable it becomes to me. It becomes a better way for me to reach my audience. So if Twitter were to send out an email tomorrow that said, hey, we're going to start charging for using Twitter, who's more likely to send a check? Someone with 10,000 followers or 10 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers. They've invested a lot more in that platform. And then finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because I can sell my goods and services on platforms like TaskRabbit and eBay and Airbnb for more money based on my investment of reputation. And how likely am I to leave one of those platforms once I've accrued all this value in the form of my reputation? Pretty hard to do. So that's it. That's a very, very high-level overview of the hook model, these 4 steps that we see repeated time and time again inside habit-forming products. And through each pass through the hook, users' preferences are shaped, their tastes and attitudes are changed, and habits are formed. Now, that was a lot of information. I apologize. I tried to squeeze a lot into a very short period of time. There's a lot more in the book and on my website, nirandfar.com. But if you need to encapsulate the hook model in one slide, this would be it. That if you're trying to build a habit-forming technology, you need to fundamentally ask yourself, number one, what's the internal trigger that your product is addressing? What's the itch? Number two, what's the external trigger that gets the user to the product? Number three, what's the simplest action done in anticipation of a reward? The reward itself, is it fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass? So before I go, there's one more thing I want to talk about. And that's something I don't think we talk about enough at these type of conferences, which is the morality of manipulation. That, let's face it, when we're designing behaviors for people to do, for our ends in mind, we have a very special responsibility. This is a form of manipulation. And we need to be very careful here, because the technologies that we're building here in Silicon Valley are the ones that users are taking with them to bed every night. They're the first thing they reach for in the morning before they even say hello to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogost said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So what responsibility do we have as product designers, as innovators, as investors? What responsibility do we have? Well, I believe that we have more power to affect people's day-to-day lives through the ubiquitous nature of our technology than ever before. And it is not a responsibility that we should take lightly. So I encourage you to use the psychology of habit design, to use what you've learned here to fix one of the world's problems. You know, that's one thing we have no shortage of. I encourage you to engage people in something meaningful, something important, and to borrow from the words of Gandhi, to build the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much. Before I go, one last thing. I'd love to hear what you thought about the presentation, if you have any feedback. And if you'd like these slides, just go to this URL, www.opinion2.us. Notice it's not .com, it's .us. Very, very short survey, a lot of radio buttons, just 5 questions. Push submit, and you'll be taken to my slide share page, where you can have all these slides for yourself to share with anyone you'd like. Thank you again.